You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Robert Wright of Augustana University. Robert, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks for having me, Garrett.
So, Robert's the author of The Poverty of Slavery, How Unfree Labor Pollutes the Economy. This episode's going to be the first in a series about American slavery in particular, prompted to do this by a New York Times special called 1619, where they're sort of highlighting slavery and trying to remember and honor slaves, but they also cited some problematic literatures in the economic history field. So we're going to have another look at slavery and maybe have a different perspective on some aspects. Nobody, of course, is going to have the perspective that that slavery was particularly good or just or moral, but we might have a different perspective on whether it enriched the economy as a whole or led to long-term development. So, Robert, tell me about your book. How did you get into researching the history of slavery?
Well, I studied under Bill Freeling at SUNY Buffalo back in the 90s, and also Richard Ellis, and took a few graduate seminars with them and so forth. But slavery was always just kind of something that I studied because you kind of have to do that if you want to teach economic history, right? But then in 2010, I was at a conference and I met a fellow named Jim Stewart, who's an historian, mostly of abolitionists. And he had a desk and it had a sign up that said Historians Against Slavery. And so I asked him, what do you mean? Everyone's against slavery, right? And he said, oh, I'm not talking about slavery in the past. I'm talking about slavery today. And of course, that really piqued my interest. I had vaguely heard a little bit about, sex trafficking and whatnot, but I began to investigate the literature on modern slavery and was just appalled at the extent of it. So I joined the board of Historians Against Slavery, and I'm still on the board. And now I'm also the treasurer of the NGO, which is international in scope, but quite modest. Our mission is to try to inform activists so that they have the right context for going in and doing their work. So that was kind of the genesis of my renewed interest in slavery. So I came out with a book in 2010 called Fubarnomics, and there's just one chapter in there on the it's a very simple model of firm labor choice, right? So you're a firm and you're thinking, well, what sort of laborer should I use? Should I use family? Should I use wage? Should I use slave? Right? That sort of thing. And it's just kind of been sitting out there. And if there are any graduate students interested in making that model, more formal, I encourage you to take a look and to try to do that. So I continued with my work in various areas, and with Historians Against Slavery. I was the first editor of its series with Cambridge University Press, which again, for any graduate students out there who are writing in the slavery area, I encourage you to take a look at. I'm no longer the main editor, but it's in very good hands at this point. And I wrote Poverty of Slavery over these years in reaction to this new economic history of capitalism literature that was coming out that was just, I found appallingly wrong empirically, and also appallingly wrong morally.
Yeah. So let's talk about that new history of capitalism literature, because that's what has sparked controversy just in the last week as we're recording this in August of 2019, because the New York Times cited it uncritically. So one chapter in your book, in your 2017 book, The Poverty of Slavery, is Yet Another Half Untold, which is a reference to The Half That Has Never Been Told, book by Ed Baptist that the New York Times cites. Do you want to talk a little bit about first Baptist book and your response to it?
Well, you know, Ed ultimately wants reparations for the descendants of enslaved persons in the United States. And in order to try to make a case for that, he tries to argue that essentially slavery made the U.S. economic growth miracle occur. And in the process, he makes all kinds of errors, very basic stuff, but, you know, he double and triple counts things in order to get slavery up to, you know, cotton accounting for like 50% of GDP, which is just, you know, outrageously wrong empirically. It's also wrong morally, because what these Ivy League professors, and it's just not Baptist, but it's also, you know, Beckert, Sven Beckert to some degree, that other guy now up at Harvard, Walter Johnson, they are making it seem as though slavery is what led to U.S. and British economic growth, right? Mm-hmm. So there are people in, what do we call them now? Developing countries.
Or less economically developed, maybe? Or low income. Low income's easy.
Okay. Yeah, I won't call them what Trump does, but there are places that would like to have an economic growth spurt. Their leaders say, hey, you know, you guys had tariffs. And there are people in the U.S. who say that tariffs were good for the economy. And now you're telling us through, you know, the WTO and the GATT and all that, we can't have tariffs? Hey, you guys got rich by polluting the environment. And now you're putting pressure on us not to pollute, right? It seems like you're trying to keep us poor. And now it comes out that slavery is why you guys are so rich. And now you're forcing anti-trafficking laws down our throats, right? So they're using it to justify non-enforcement of the various and sundry international laws and treaties and so forth that have been trying to reduce incentives for people to enslave others. You know, the numbers vary widely. It's illicit markets, so it's hard to get firm numbers, but about 40 million people worldwide now fall under slave-like conditions. And, you know, there's a big literature on this. Kevin Bales is the expert and the fellow who has developed the methodology for trying to come up with these numbers. But just on my car radio this morning, there's a advertisement for where I live, which is Sioux Falls, South Dakota, right? So very rural place. Population of Sioux Falls is about 180,000 right now. And the market area is about 1 million, right? So we're not talking about a huge place here. There's a anti-trafficking NGO who says they average 2 people a day being discovered in conditions that are considered by international law to be slavery. 2 a day out of this, and those are the ones being freed. So what is the stock? Don't know, but and that's just in this area. And of course, when you go to LDCs, it's even more prevalent because there's less rule of law, and so it's truly a big problem. Now, in the scale of history, and by the way, my book tries to cover all places and all times. There is a concentration on the U.S. just because that's my intellectual background, but I do look at slavery in a wide variety of societies going all the way back into prehistory to the extent that that's possible. And we just don't find evidence that slavery is a necessary or sufficient cause for economic growth. So if anything, we grew rich in spite of slavery, just like we grew rich in spite of protective tariffs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the New History of Capitalism literature, which kind of argues that slavery is a big part of why America is wealthy today, and the UK and other wealthy countries, they're doing it from sort of a perspective that if we're wealthy today because of slave labor, then we owe, that's sort of a stain on our wealth, and we can sort of expunge that stain by, the example you gave is reparations, but, other
Right.
other reforms to kind of, maybe one can imagine various reforms that you might propose to sort of expunge the moral stain of slavery.
In fact, I've posted some ideas on the American Institute for Economic Research blog. I say that I forget what it's called, but something like the case for real reparations, and it's mostly about prison reform and criminal justice reform, because that is a clear area of injustice, and it's one that classical liberals can get behind. I'm sure but just to remind listeners, Adam Smith said the only thing that is needed to bring a country from the lowest barbarism to the highest level of opulence is peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. And that's the best model of economic growth that I think has ever been made. But of course, defining some of those terms is kind of tricky. But our administration of justice, certainly could use some more work to make it more tolerable.
Mm-hmm.
What concerns me, Garrett, would be cash reparations, because there's all kinds of problems with it that I discuss in the book. One is because I have this broad definition of slavery. I define people on a scale of freedom from 0 to 20, where 0 would be the worst situation you can imagine, Simon Legree in Uncle Tom's cabin sort of situation, to a 20, which, would be like CEOs of corporations or tenured college professors. And so there's all kinds of gradations in between. Even within chattel slavery, within the U.S., they weren't all zeros. Some enslaved persons in some situations in the antebellum U.S. had some discretion, to the point that some of them rebelled after the Civil War because they had less freedom after it than they had during slavery. And this was primarily in the Low Country in South Carolina, where they were growing rice and they were on a task system. And so, it's just fascinating, and we got to move away from that binary distinction between a slave and a non-slave. There have been all kinds of ways that laborers have had their liberty restricted in the past, and we need to acknowledge that. But more concretely, even if we just wanted to stick with chattel slaves, many of them, of course, were fathered by slave owners. So their descendants alive today are not just descendants of slaves, they're also descendants of slave owners.
Yeah, wow.
So are they going to make reparation payments to themselves? And then we have other groups like Indians, American Indians, sometimes wrongly called Native Americans, who in many ways have been much more clearly oppressed right up to the present time. While a few tribes became notorious because they set up casinos near major urban areas, most of the tribes in the West are still very, very poor. And it's mostly because they live under socialist system that's imposed upon them by the BIA, the Bureau for Indian Affairs. I was just appalled when I started to investigate the situations on the Indian reservations out west here in South Dakota and Montana and so forth, because many of the policies that some of the Democratic candidates are calling for are already in place on Indian reservations, and they're impoverishing people. They're infantilizing them. They are expunging native entrepreneurial drive. I wrote a book called Little Business on the Prairie that came out in 2015, where I discuss the very great history of entrepreneurship among American Indians that was just squelched and killed by the BIA in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and would be another wonderful topic for a young graduate student to pick up on and do some quant work on.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding your sort of general point correctly, are you saying that trying to sort of adjudicate all past injustices and have the descendants of the injustice doers and the descendants of the people who suffered the injustice, make like a transfer to make it right. That's basically a rabbit hole that kind of gets very absurd once you go down.
It gets very absurd. What do you do with American Indians who owned black slaves?
Oh no. Yeah.
Right? And their descendants make $10,000 a year. and you're going to have them pay reparations to Michael Jordan?
Yeah, and I
don't
think,
make no sense.
I mean, I think the reparations would probably just be, taken out of general revenues and given to all people in a certain racial group. Well, but of course, what if you're so then you're sort of paying even if you migrated here or to North America in the 20th century after it was all done, or maybe even receiving payments after it, if you were, let's say your family lived in Kenya till the 1930s, so was not part of slavery, but you're still part of the ethnic group that was enslaved, just sort of part of, it's hard to draw lines around
Well, yeah, I mean, Kenya's a good example because most East African slaves were sold into the Indian Ocean slavery system instead of the transatlantic one that that we usually default to as Americans. But there were multiple groups who were taking large numbers of Africans out of Africa, and a relatively small percentage of them, of course, came to the United States. But, if we're just taking money out of general revenues and giving it to poor people, Garrett, I'm looking at your picture right now, and I'm guessing you're too young to remember this. And even I only know it from history books. But there was something in the 1960s called the Great Society.
I have heard of it. I am too young to actually have experienced it.
Lyndon Baines Johnson and all of that. And it was essentially, it wasn't called reparations, but it was essentially a reparations plan. And if you read books like Charles Murray's Losing Ground, you'll see that it was an utter and complete failure because giving money to people doesn't help them ultimately. Right now, I'm not talking about, somebody, in a catastrophe area. Obviously, they need, food and water. Somebody with a string of bad luck, give them temporary aid so they get back on their feet. That can be crucial. But this sort of, we're going to give you so many dollars every month, no matter what, infantilizes people. It just destroys them. It destroys their incentive. It destroys the way that they think about themselves. Right? Yeah. Even if they think of it as reparations for past ills done, it's still, they're not contributing to our economy and to our society. And, so they come to look down upon themselves. And that leads me to a point that I make in my most recent book, Financial Exclusion, which just came out this year from the American Institute for Economic Research. I talk about discrimination in financial institutions and markets for four groups: Indians, African Americans, women, and then also members of my own group, which go by many, many names, but the most generic name is white trash. Yeah. And so I was a recipient of some of those Great Society programs, my family was, in the 1970s. And it devastated my family because, we were the poor kids. We were the outcasts. We were, we lived in a federal housing project and we're getting assistance for a few years. And it just, destroyed my sense of self-worth and has really affected my entire life. I'm working to overcome it, probably overcompensating by publishing 19 books, but it was, it was just devastating. And it would have been so much better if the federal government had paid more attention to, monetary policy and not allowed the great inflation to happen, which was partially caused by the Vietnam War. that takes us back to Smith and Peace, right? But also, the Great Society programs were causing part of that great inflation, along with the Fed messing up, of course, and the oil shocks. But if they had just stuck to their bread and butter, like we had up through the 1920s, then we wouldn't have suffered, macroeconomically so much, and my parents wouldn't have had to have moved into a federal housing project. They wouldn't have had to have, we used to have this thing called government cheese, where a truck would show up and they'd give out cheese out the back, and the political economy of that is whack. That would make a nice little article for like a Vincent Geloso type or something like that, but somebody like that. But basically, the government was stockpiling cheese, and it was for price support programs basically. But they were saying that they were stocking it up, in case of war, right? Well, the cheese is eventually going to go bad. So when it's nearing the end of its expiration date, what do you do with it? It looks really bad if you throw it out or if you burn it or something. So they gave it away to the poor people.
Right.
How do you think it felt to stand at the back of a truck and get free cheese?
Yeah. So, how we got on this topic is we're discussing reparations and, just
right.
the many issues with actually implementing such a policy, identifying who pays and who gets paid, and then just the sort of transfers that we're likely to do, or are they likely to help? Not so much. But to get back to the sort of historical slavery issue, the big part of this is if slavery was beneficial for long-term development, if it's part of the reason that, America is wealthy today, or, just the sort of the West or the OECD or, wealthy countries are wealthy, then, there's presumably a surplus that you could draw from to compensate the descendants of the people who helped create that surplus but didn't share in it.
Right.
Part of your book is arguing that, in fact, slavery did not cause additional economic growth or development. And so first, let's start with the question: was slavery profitable to the people who own slaves? That get that easy question knocked out of the park.
Yes, absolutely. No doubt about it. That's why they held slaves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
now you'll find a couple of instances, especially in the ancient world, where supposedly people held slaves merely as status symbols. I don't believe that really, because there were markets for them, right? So they're assets, not just symbols.
Mm-hmm.
You could sell them if you had to. So I think the historians that have made claims like that, have just been, kind of like Marxist sociologist types, and haven't really thought through the economics of that. But yeah, that is profitability is why slaveholders held slaves.
Yeah, and
that gets back to that model that I mentioned in Fubarnomics.
Yeah, and so conditional on slavery being an institution in your society, you may have an incentive to use it, but the key thing we want to stress is that just because something is profitable for an individual does not mean it is necessarily efficient, zoom out to the level of the economy as a whole, or good for long-term economic growth. So where does the inefficiency, at the societal level come in from having slavery as an institution and having, many of a large portion of your workforce enslaved rather than free?
I frame it as negative externalities, which is why pollution is in the subtitle of the book. There are folks like Jeff Hummel who frame it slightly differently as deadweight losses. And when I was writing the book, I discussed, the differences between that, and he didn't come out and say, no, negative externalities is wrong. It's got to be deadweight loss view. So yeah, it's negative externalities in my view, and I spend a couple of chapters just going through all of the negative externalities that enslaving other human beings cause. And the most obvious common sense one are the control costs. People don't want to be enslaved, and so they do all sorts of things. And the enslavers are often, of course, among the wealthiest people and the most politically powerful people in these societies. And they see these control costs mounting to the point where it might tip them over into another labor form. But they have this big sunk cost in the purchase or the raising of the slaves. So they are often able to get legislation passed that throws those control costs off onto the rest of society. So in the antebellum South of the U.S., this manifested itself in slave patrols, where they leverage basically the old militia laws to force poor whites to walk around at night, interdicting, slave movements that could have been used for insurrection. They had public slave whipping posts, especially in bigger cities like Richmond, so that if you were feigning Southern Belle and you couldn't bring yourself to whip a recalcitrant slave, you could take them to the public whipping post and have them flogged at public expense, right? And these things might seem minor, but when you start thinking about all the different ways that control costs were thrown off on the rest of society, like fugitive slave acts, as they were called in the U.S. Well, many societies had such laws. If you ran across somebody and identified them as a slave, which was often done in the past via branding or clothing or the way the hair was styled, or even just their demeanor, you were supposed to to capture them and to return them to their rightful owner. So that again is throwing control costs off onto the rest of society. Oftentimes it's said, that slaves didn't rebel very much. It's utter baloney. They're rebelling quite frequently in quite deadly ways. And, it's not an annual event in every location, to be sure, but it was enough where white Southern slaveholders often feared for their lives because, especially in districts where they're outnumbered and, if the master's away on business or something, they were quite fearful. There are huge externalities that are created by being an enslaver. It distorts people's personalities. And, Stowe's Simon Legree is a extreme example of that. But many people who became slaveholders, especially later in life and, were more mature and could reflect on it and whatnot, realized that the institution was changing them for the worse. It was making them mean, violent people. And, slaveholders didn't have very much incentive to invest in public schools. In fact, they had disincentives to invest in public schools. They didn't have very strong incentives to invest in local infrastructure. As long as they could get their cotton or their rice or whatever they were producing, to market, that was good enough. Good infrastructure would have facilitated slaves fleeing. So what you end up with is one of these natural experiments, Garrett, which I love, that we've seen, numerous times in world history, but most recently in like the difference between East and West Germany and North and South Korea, where you take a country and you divide it in two, and then you give it two different systems of political economy, and you watch for several decades and see what happens. Well, this is essentially what happened in the U.S. The North, there's some remnants of slavery and whatnot, but it slowly rids itself of it, and then you have this Southern slave economy, and you watch it over several decades, and you see the North develop, industrialize, attract immigrants, and what does the South do? It expands, right? It gets bigger. It's just from just being on the East Coast, but it spreads westward. And there are a couple of railroads, and I actually did a book that came out in 2014 called Corporation Nation that shows that there were surprising numbers of business corporations, especially incorporated in the South, even in per capita terms. So it's not that they were totally stagnant down there, but you just don't see the density of like the commercial and the transportation interlinkages. You see people in Alabama burning down telegraph lines because they don't want that development, because it's not gonna benefit them, and it may very well hurt them. So I don't attempt to put any numbers on any of the stuff in my book, because I was afraid if I did so that I might get nitpicked on the exact number. And I was not interested in that time in getting nitpicked. I just wanted to make the overall argument. But if there are graduate students out there who want to go and try to put some estimated numbers on that, I will help them every way that I can to do that. And if I get the right job down the road, I might attempt it myself. The book basically is a preface for a much bigger, David Brian Davis sort of tome that I have in my brain, that would get into much more detail. Mm-hmm. What I'm just trying to do in this book is more, kind of shock and awe, and just point out all these major negative externalities caused everywhere at all times when you try to restrict human liberty to the point that people start identifying you as a slave.
Yeah. So the key sort of central point, at least towards the argument of slavery being inefficient, or, is that a lot of the costs are borne by the state or by the public or the taxpayer. So modern analogy, which of course does not have the same moral weight, would be maybe almond farmers in California, where they depend so heavily on subsidized water that they're actually using $10 of water to make $1 worth of almonds, but they get it subsidized.
Yes.
Don't quote me on those exact numbers, but it's something like that.
I know what you're talking about. Yep.
Yeah, and basically the argument here is that if you had a system where slavery is legal, but the slave owner has to pay all the costs of putting down slave revolts, catching slaves when they escape, punishing slaves when they misbehave, and all those, just seeing them as costs, and making the slave owner actually pay them, you would basically see a transition then to free labor, which doesn't have to be caught when it runs away. When you have paid laborers, if they just don't show up for work one day, well, you just stop paying them, right? Rather than buying them up front and then having to make sure they don't get away so you can get, your money's worth out of them.
Right. And my argument, though, isn't that slavery would go to zero, because we have slavery today even where it's illegal. Mm-hmm. But it's not chattel slavery, right? And in fact, that makes the material conditions of today's slaves much worse than the material conditions for antebellum slaves.
Do you want to define chattel, just for the audience?
Well, that they're owned, that they're assets that can show up on a balance sheet, that can be insured, that can be bought and sold, and the legal right to own them is protected by the state. The slaves today aren't owned in that way; they're controlled, and while too many states will look the other way, there's only like one country in the world that will still enforce property rights, on people owning people.
Which country is that?
So it's all illicit stuff. Mauritania.
Okay, so that's in...
Yes, Mauritania.
Yeah, that's in West Africa.
Saharan Africa.
Yeah,
yes,
sort of southwest of the Saharan. Not to be confused with the ancient Berber kingdom of Mauritania that was a Roman province. I recently looked it up for some reason. So okay. I'm happy that I have some facts about it. But so that one country, it's amazing to me that there is even one country that enforces property rights on slaves, and that there hasn't been something like the anti-apartheid movement, to boycott their goods and sort of force them to not do this.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a whole chapter in one of Kevin Bales's books on modern slavery. But it's not a very populous country, and overall, Bales' works cut against actually, freeing those folks, because people who are enslaved but who are not chattel slaves tend to be treated in much, much worse ways. They sell even today for far less in nominal dollars than chattel slaves did in the antebellum U.S. There are some places in the world, like Southeast Asia, where you can buy a girl for $10.
Wow.
So if you have $10, invested in, and she pulls 5 tricks and she's already reimbursed you that money, and she can pull 5 tricks in an hour. And in some of the worst ones that they call abattoirs, they're doing 5 tricks an hour up to 20 hours a day.
So are there activists?
If they die, they die, right? Yeah. Then you just go buy another one.
Are there activists just buying these people and then freeing them like that? That it seems very cheap.
Yeah. Well, there's two. There are a lot of things there, Garrett. One is that they don't like to do that because for moral reasons, right?
And the incentives, right?
And the incentives, yeah. And there were actually cases in Africa in the 1990s that I discuss in the book where NGOs came. They were Christians, so they were doing it on religious grounds. Because there are quite a few Christians in East Africa, and like the Horn and whatnot, Ethiopia. There are these old Coptic sects, and then some from missionary work in the 19th century and whatnot. So they were going in on religious grounds and buying them. And at first, apparently, they did buy some legitimately enslaved Christians. But then, all of a sudden, all these slaves started showing up. And they were making payments to the presumed enslavers, but they were fake slaves. They were just being brought in so the fake enslavers could get the payment, and then they were splitting the proceeds. So, yeah, no, it would be nice because there's definitely enough money in the international anti-slavery pool where they could buy up most of these slaves because they are so cheap. But that's just going to give incentive to go out and enslave more, or to do this fake enslaving sort of stuff. So yeah,
the obvious solution is a bad idea for also pretty obvious reasons, but. Yeah, I thought I'd ask. Yeah, so do you want to? You mentioned a couple cases of places that have modern slavery, the sex trade in Southeast Asia. I've heard about a couple. I think coltan mining in Central Africa, and I think there are press gangs in the fishing industry. Also, I think in Southeast Asia, if I remember correctly.
Huge numbers in India and Pakistan, and most of those are not sex laborers. They're making bricks or weaving carpets. In Nepal, they just break rocks. They take big boulders, from the Himalaya mountains, and they take a sledgehammer to them and they just break them down so that they're of a size that can be used in construction. Mm-hmm. Most of the rainforest being burned down in Brazil is being done by people who are kind of de facto slaves that score very low on my freedom scale, generally around 2 or 3. So yeah, Kevin Bales has a new book out about that a lot of the environmental degradation that's going on in the world today is not your Rio Tintos and BHPs and whatnot. It's actually being done by slave laborers.
Okay.
Yeah, they're called gatos in Brazil, the slave foreman, which I don't know Portuguese, but in Spanish means cats, right? I guess kind of like tomcats. Well, it turns out they score very low on the freedom scale as well.
Oh, the people doing
a 4 or 5. The people doing the supervising.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's like in the antebellum South where you had slave drivers, right? Who were slaves, but whose job it was to drive other slaves. Force them to work.
Yeah, so that the pervasiveness of slavery in the modern world should be a big focus on just when we're talking about slavery, that people who are very sort of America centric, to them it's like this thing in the past that's this original sin, and how are we going to now that every person who was plantation slave has passed away and every person that owned a slave in the U.S. has passed away, what can we do to sort of still right this wrong in the present? Or is it clear that there's anything we can do when all the people involved, lived so long ago? But taking a global view, it's still an institution that's all over the world, especially in the very poor parts. And, we need to be talking about it with that in mind, that it's not just this sort of historical curiosity or thing in the past to be accounted for, but something that is ongoing.
Yep. I claim in the book with no real empirical evidence, but again, if there's some empirically minded listener out there who can think of a way of nailing this down. But I claim in the book that every human being alive today is both a descendant of a slave and a descendant of a slaveholder. And it might not be, the immediate link like with antebellum slavery, but when you start to see how many different societies enslaved others in the past, the mind just boggles, like the Vikings raiding England and Ireland for slaves, and Eastern Europe has been, was basically a major export. Eastern Europeans enslaved by Western Europeans in the Catholic Church and sold into Asiatic slavery. It's just the arrows going all directions, and it's very deep. And that's why it's so important to talk about liberty as much as possible, right? Because slavery is the antithesis of liberty, and you think that there would be more, common ground between classical liberals like myself and anti-slavery folks today, but most of them tend to come from the left and have that, that sort of framework in mind when they're thinking about these issues.
Yeah, so a lot of the debate around liberty is in wealthy countries that do not practice slavery, and maybe we're talking about changing the tax rate or the sort of licensing regime for if you want to cut hair or something, and that's really that's liberty, but it's at the upper end of that scale, making someone who is already very free slightly more or slightly less free. But just seems more important to try to take people who are a 1 or a 2 on the liberty scale and try to get them up to a 5 or a 6. That would
be a huge improvement.
Just from the perspective of trying to help the least fortunate, and just the idea that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there, right? It's going to generally be often it's less costly to help someone who is very destitute than it is to help someone who's already doing pretty well. The costs are just
right.
Can be lower. Depends on the situation.
Yes, that's right. And that reminds me that to circle back to the beginning and some of the errors in the Baptist book and this new economic history of capitalism, they have no sense whatsoever of marginalism. So they write and think and act as though if there hadn't have been cotton, that all those people in the South would have just stood around with their thumbs up there, doing nothing. Right. Instead of doing the next available, the next most lucrative thing. They also mess up on the population stuff because they say, the South really needed those slave laborers. Well, the North attracted all of the immigrants because they didn't want to have anything to do with slavery. If the South didn't have slavery, then many of those immigrants would have gone south and could have provided free labor or family labor, like family farms and whatnot. For someone who's thinking about doing something very technical, like a chapter for a PhD dissertation in economics, there were German families in Texas without slaves who were growing cotton profitably. Edward Atkinson discusses it, the great classical liberal textile guy, and then later on free trader. He discusses it in one of his Civil War pamphlets. And we really need a good, solid empirical investigation of that claim.
Right. Free labor, not free as in priced at zero, but free as in the laborer is a free person, grew cotton in Germany, as you mentioned, and I believe in Asia, too. There was a cotton industry there.
No. These were Germans who moved to Texas.
Oh, Germans in Texas.
They were growing in Texas, growing cotton on family farms. And the reason it's important is because it gets into that whole scale literature, right? Where some economic historians say, slavery was very efficient because they were able to work at these large scales and whatnot. You can never grow cotton in small scale.
Right.
It's not like corn in the North sort of thing. Yeah. That might not hold water. But again, I don't know anyone who's looked at those German families in Texas, and this would have been in the 1850s. And looked at them very closely.
Same time, same place, different labor model. it would be really interesting to get to figure out who was more productive, in terms of how much cotton they got for how much land and labor they invested.
Especially for a young economist, who wants to do some econometric work, which is not my forte. I mean, I'm still trying to figure out random forest, so I've lots of ideas of things that could be done. And any listeners out there who want to contact me, I encourage them to, and I'll share what I know.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're doing a master's degree or starting a PhD program, I think one thing I've learned doing this podcast is you can email just about any professor, and the vast majority of them will write back, and especially if you're interested in research and their research or doing research related to what they're doing, it's you should absolutely use that resource. So, Robert, do you have any closing thoughts? Any sort of general takeaways someone who listened to this conversation should have?
Reparations is not a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
Slavery did not cause American economic growth. Liberty did. And that's about it.
Okay, great. So my guest today has been Robert Wright. Robert, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks for having me. It was great fun.
That concludes this episode of Economics Detective Radio. So this one's going to be the first in a series about slavery and the economic history of slavery. I think it was really interesting to hear about just how much slavery there is in the modern world, and it puts the whole discussion into good context. We'll get some people to talk about the more sort of statistical issues around slavery and development, and hopefully have that in coming weeks. We won't necessarily do every episode about slavery over the next few weeks because I have some interviews scheduled about other things, but I'll let you know when something is a slavery episode, so we can all sort of do a more in-depth dive than a single episode, get some different perspectives. I'm reaching out to several different people, and I'm going to regret all this if they all say no, but I have at least one other interview scheduled as of right now. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back soon.